The Armenoid Invasion, Part 1. But before we get too deep into the video, first I want to tell you guys about my social media platforms. So I have a Clubhouse account, and we can actually talk to one another on it. I also host Clubhouse rooms every now and then where I might talk about history and genetics of the Middle East and Africa. I have a Twitter page, a Facebook account, and a Facebook page, as well as a Instagram, all titled The Hebrew of Israel. And what I typically do on these platforms is post upcoming videos as well as slides for my presentations. And so just be on the lookout for all of that on my social media platforms. And if you want to support me financially for the channel, you can look at my Patreon as well as my PayPal and my GoFundMe. And with all of that out of the way, let's begin with the video. In the Middle East, there is a strong evidence that populations to the north of the Near East migrated or invaded the lands south of them. There was a semi-replacement of the indigenous populations and even adoption into the culture of the original Middle Eastern populations. But eventually, the autochthonous Middle Eastern populations were somewhat diluted over time, or migrated south. The invaders were the Armenoid peoples. I use this term invasion similar to the idea of the Aryan invasion of India, and biologists in the past have even used this term. And the indigenous Middle Easterners would be your brown Eurafricans / brown Mediterraneans, or simply called Semites. Evidence of this Armenoid invasion will be in the order of 1. Legend and tradition of warfare between northern Near Easterners, specifically from the southern Caucasus, Armenia, against southern Near Easterners, Mesopotamia, aka the Akkadian Empire. 2. Biology, because there is cranial evidence of a change in racial type, air quotes, the indigenous Middle Eastern Semites of the brown Eurafrican type and the northern Armenoid type mixing and increasing in the Middle East. 3. Modern scientific studies that confirm a diluting and interbreeding of two Middle Eastern types, or the original Middle Eastern populations sort of slightly disappearing or migrating. 4. Ancient / modern historical records of invaders from northern Mesopotamia that were non-Semitic speakers but collapsed Semitic civilizations in Mesopotamia. These 4 aspects and more will be used to cover and confirm a type of Armenoid invasion of the Middle East. And remember, think of this as the same as the Aryan invasion of India. Think of it in similar terms. But before we get too deep into the video, first I want to tell you guys about my social media platforms. So I have a Clubhouse account, and we can actually talk to one another on it. I also host Clubhouse rooms every now and then where I might talk about history and genetics of the Middle East and Africa. I have a Twitter page, a Facebook account, and a Facebook page, as well as a Instagram, all titled The Hebrew of Israel. And what I typically do on these platforms is post upcoming videos as well as slides for my presentations. And so just be on the lookout for all of that on my social media platforms. And if you want to support me financially for the channel, you can look at my Patreon as well as my PayPal and my GoFundMe. And with all of that out of the way, let's begin with the video. The invasion of the Armenoids, the brown Eurafricans versus
the Armenoids. There are ancient legends of warfare between people from the southern Caucasus, particularly in the region of Armenia, and Semites to the south in Mesopotamia. The most notable legend is the story of Hayek the Armenian. According to the accounts of Moses of Coron and Sextus Julius Africanus, the battle occurred between the dynasty of Hayek and the Chaldean dynasty in its third generation that had control of Babylon and the remaining territory of Akkadia under King Bulus, a symbolic Babylonian/Akkadian god of war, or founder of Babylon depending on mythological tradition. The conflict is said to have happened in 2492 BCE or 2107 BCE. In Moses of Coron's account, Hayek, son of Torgom, had a child named Amrenek while he was living in Babylon, after the arrogant titan Bel made himself king over all. Hayek immigrated to the region near Mount Ararat. Hayek relocated near Mount Ararat with his extended household of at least 300 and settled there, founding a village he named Hayastan. Bel decided to march against him with a massive force, but Hayek was warned ahead of time by Kedemos of his pending approach. He assembled his own army along the shore of Lake Van and told them that they must defeat and kill Bel or die trying to do so, rather than become his slaves. Hayek and his people, from the time of their forefathers Noah and Japheth, had migrated south towards the warmer lands near Babylon. But proud Hayek refused to submit to Bel. As soon as his son Amranek was born, Hayek rose up and led his people northward into the land of Ararat. And just by judging the migration of this story, it would seem like Hayek, his ancestor being Japheth and Noah, so Japhites, were in the area around the Caucasus, around places like Mount Ararat, and they migrated south to warmer lands. And it seems like this migration is to look for more rich, fertile territory. And then a tyrant rose, and this caused the people to leave from the Fertile Crescent, going back to the Caucasus, in which a war ensued. So that's very interesting from what we covered in the past about such migrations of these Caucasian populations going into the Fertile Crescent and going back to the Caucasus, back and forth migrations. So it's interesting seeing this in this legend. But anyways, continuing with this understanding of warfare between peoples of the North and peoples of the South. This is from Ancient History Encyclopedia, Armenian Mythology, and it reads, "This is the story of Hayek and Bel, and places the origins of the Armenian people as the descendants of the biblical Noah, via his son Japheth. Hayek, a descendant of Japheth and noted archer, hence his later association with Orion, rebelled one day against Bel, the evil and repressive Babylonian tyrant, and returned back to his homeland around Mount Ararat in ancient Armenia. Bel followed Hayek and his relations so that a mighty battle followed in which Bel was killed. Hayek then gave his name to his descendants, the Hay people, and the name of the region of Armenia in the Armenian language, Hayeste." This is from the Heritage of Armenian Literature, Volume 1, and it reads, "Hayek, the legendary archer, has been part of Armenian culture and history since time immemorial. Hayek is considered the patriarch of the Armenians, and it is indeed for this reason the Armenians call themselves Hay. The well-known epic of Hayek's fight against Bel provides substantial proof that Hayek and his people stood up against Bel and halted the unrestrained influx of Semitic peoples from the south. And so we do see that these people, these Armenian people or Armenian tribes of various people, descending from Hayek, who descend from Japheth, were basically fighting populations of people to the south who were Semites. So you do see sort of like a warfare in a sense between the descendants of Japheth and the descendants of Shem, peoples from the northern part of the Near East fighting peoples from the southern part of the Near East, which is kind of interesting. Now we can actually see using crania a change in biology of northern Armenoid types coming into Mesopotamia in the south and mixing with the more brown Eurafrican peoples. So the story that we read about this legend of Hayek versus Bel, we might be able to actually prove it just simply using biology, that there was influxes of people from the north to the south just based on crania alone. This is from an encyclopedia of world history, and it reads, the population of both Upper and Lower Mesopotamia in prehistoric times belonged to the brown or Mediterranean race. While this basic stock persisted in historical times, especially in the south, it became increasingly mixed, especially the broad-headed Armenoid peoples from the northeastern mountains owing to the recurrent incursions of mountain tribes into the plains. So basically, you have in ancient times, the Mesopotamian populations were more like a brown Mediterranean race, but then peoples from the north came in south into the plains, peoples from the mountains, and these were a broad-headed Armenoid peoples, and they mixed as well. So this is from The Races of Europe this is by Carlton Stephen Coons, and it reads, the Armenoid racial type, which is the third one claimed in Mesopotamia, begins with the earliest Kish graves and continued through the Babylonian period. Most of the so-called Armenoid skulls are mesocephalic or subbrachiocephalic. Although many of the skulls which have been called Armenoid may represent merely a rounder-headed extreme of the total population, it is nevertheless probable that a planoccipital brachiocephalic strain actually penetrated Mesopotamia during the 3rd millennium BC. So basically it's saying that around the time of the 3rd millennium BC, we do begin to see this Armenoid strain or this Armenoid type come into the region, come into the land. So keep that in mind, 3rd millennium BC. Now, continuing, it says, the series of skeletal remains at our disposal, other than the series from Al-Umbud, include a series from Kish from graves which may be dated at some time close to 2900 BC, then B, another from the same site from 4th dynasty graves prior to 2500 BC, then C, skulls from the 3rd dynasty of dated about 2300 BC, then D, Neo-Babylonian crania from between 800 and 400 BC, and then C, or E, skulls from Kerak dated at the 5th century AD. In all, well over 100 skulls or skeletons have been studied. Most of the skulls belong to the Eurafrican type. So a lot of these old skulls from these sites of Al-Umbud and Kish and etc. A lot of them belong to the Euro-African type. So continuing down, it says, the Armenoid racial type, which is the third one claimed in Mesopotamia, begins with the earliest Kish graves and continued through the Babylonian period. And so in early Kish, we see a few. It's the third type. So it's not the primary type, but it's the third type. And then it starts to increase all the way into the Babylonian period. And we know the Babylonian period being the Kassites, and we know who they are. Anyways, continuing, it reads, Brachycephalic strain actually penetrated Mesopotamia during the 3rd millennium BC. Keep that in mind. So this is from archaeology and the Sumerian problem. And it reads, regarding the people who appeared in the south at the beginning of the Uruk period, we may make two assertions. They spoke in all probability a Caucasian, a Japhetic language, and they were Brachycephalic or perhaps Mesocephalic. The people responsible for the Al-Umbud stage of culture belonged, to judge by their distribution, to the Middle Eastern section of the Mediterranean race, to the brown race of Professor Elliot Smith, in fact. But of their language, we can say nothing. So it's interesting right here how they're connecting the Caucasian language with the Japhetic language, which makes a lot of sense. A lot of people, most biblical scholars and Jewish scholars and Arabic scholars seem to agree as well. But anyways, continuing, it reads, as in the characteristics of the dolichocephalic population of Mesopotamia, Dr. Brixton distinguishes a brown Mediterranean and a brown Euro-African type. They are, in fact, often included together in the term Mediterranean, but as distinguished by Dr. Buxton, the brown Mediterranean variety seems later and related with the West, whereas the Euro-African type seems more ancient and has connections with the East. Brown Euro-African variety of the dolichocephalic population at Kish and other variety, the brown Mediterranean type, which is related with the West, can hardly have been anything but Semitic, for it is certain that we have to account for Mediterranean Semites from Arabia at an early date in Mesopotamia. For one of the most curious features of Sumerian is its isolation among languages, an isolation which only a few scholars care to deny, by asserting that it belongs to the Caucasian Japhetic languages. Now I just want to go back and make a quick note of this, that they are connecting the brown Mediterranean or the brown Euro-African with the Semitic type. And I think that's important to keep in mind. And also they're connecting Caucasian with Japhetic languages. So keep those two things in mind. Now here's another paper dealing with the infiltration, the influx of various northern peoples into Mesopotamia. This paper is called Report on the Human Remains Found at Kish, and it reads, but it is possible that even in this period, the Armenoids of the north were already beginning to infiltrate into northern Sumer. It must be remembered that soon after the fall of the Semitic empire of Akkad, the entire land of Sumer and Akkad was ruled for over a century by the Gutians from the north, between the upper and lower Zab rivers. The valuable results obtained by the authors of this paper confirm what the historians had assumed in regard to the early mixture of Sumerian and Semites at Kish, the oldest capital of Sumer and the greatest metropolis of the north, later known as Akkad. Here, Doctor Bringston finds an increasing admixture of the round-headed Armenoid type. This must be explained as an inflection from Syria and the Hittite region if they are not normal variants. So basically what we see is that you do have Armenoid peoples from the north coming into Mesopotamia, and it also kind of fits with the fall of the Akkadian Empire, which was Semitic. And we do see a mixing of this type as well. So continuing, it reads, definite examples of the people whom Hayden describes as Semites, whereas there are certainly examples of the brown and the Eurafrican races on a morphological explanation. It would appear that two branches of one stalk are to be found among the types represented by the skulls at the skulls from Kish. The third type, which is represented but sparingly, is extremely different. The head form is brachiocephalic, in some cases extremely so. There seems, however, to be little doubt that they belong to the Armenoid race. This brachiocephalic element, which forms such an important element in the population of the eastern lateral of the Mediterranean and also of the Great Bridge land stretching from India westwards. This round-headed element appears to have been slowly increasing. It is on the whole commoner in Neo-Babylonian graves and in the modern populations than in the early graves. And that part is extremely interesting. So we see that this Armenoid type is basically common in the Neo-Babylon being Kassite Babylon, and we know who the Kassites are from previous videos. But we also see this Armenoid type in modern populations as well, as it reads. And we know genetically as to why that can be the case. But what I find extremely interesting as well is that it is not seen in the earlier graves of Babylon, which would have been Kish. So that is also important to note. And continuing, it reads, as to the presence of Armenoid blood in modern times, there can be no reasonable doubt. In any case, they did not in early times form more than a very small part of the population, possibly ruling families, possibly mere stragglers, from the great migrations of round-headed peoples who were moving westward in Neolithic and Bronze Age times. Keep all of that in mind. It would appear then that we have at least two groups in the Near East, one dolichocephalic with round-headed, and one dolichocephalic, the other round-headed, and that although some members of both groups have remained unmixed, others have mingled considerably, so as to form some of the most mixed races in the world. The basal types are the brown Eurafrican group and the Armenoid group. There are, however, striking differences from the types as found at Kish. There, the dolichocephals are chiefly represented by the Eurafrican variety. In the Near East, this type, although it occurs, is comparatively rare, the more common type being the brown Mediterranean variety, closely akin to Elliott Smith's Proto-Egyptians. As far west as Crete, they form in early times the majority of the population, but to the eastward they are on the whole dominated by the round ear-headed Armenoids. The history of the Near East seems to suggest that there was a gradual inflection of the latter type, probably a, probably a tier to the Copper or Bronze Age. So we do see that in the Middle East. Basically, you do have two types of people. You have simply the brown, your African, and the Armenoid. So, as we can see from multiple biologists, that there are two racial types of people in ancient Mesopotamia: the brown, your African, and the Armenoid. The Armenoids were in the north and they came south into Mesopotamia, and the Eurafricans are Semitic populations already in Mesopotamia. Now, what I find interesting about those studies are two things. One, the Armenoid invasion occurred in the 3rd millennium BC, which is the early Bronze Age. And two, uh, only by using skulls, we were able to find a shift and change in the population. Now, let's do a quick recap of the brown Eurafrican and the Armenoid. What are these types? What does this mean, basically? So, the Armenoid, short-headed and high-skulled type with fleshy features, a flat occiput and hooked nose, often black-haired with light brown skin, common in mountain regions of Asia Minor, especially Armenia and Anatolia. Was found in ancient Sumerians, Babylonians, Hittites, and Cretans around 4000 BCE. And this is from Anthropology. Armenoid. Other characteristics are hair color dark brown to black, usually wavy to curly in form, roughly straight. Their head is broad, brachiocephalic. They are concentrated in Turkey, Syria, and Palestine, Iraq, Iran, and Balkan countries. Their typical representatives are ancient Hittites. This is from Contributions to the Anthropology of Iran, and it reads, Houghton, Houghton, defines the Armenoid type as follows. I'm just going to read, it's not highlighted, but read right here the nose form. Nose form is convex, high-bridged, long, and often rather wide. And skipping down, head form brachiocephalic, hair color black or brown, eye color brown, skin color olive or brunette white, hair form usually wavy, sometimes curly or straight, distribution concentrated in the Near East, Asia Minor, Syria, Persia, common in Greece, Romania, Bulgaria, largely represented in urban populations of Russia, Poland, Hungary, Austria, uh, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslovakia, Germany, United States. Typical peoples: most Armenians, Turks, and Syrians, many Persians, and Ashkenazim Jews. The so-called Armenoid type is defined by Hayden under the Eurasiatic brachycephals as Anatolian Armenian, dark-haired, tawny, white skin, and medium stature, very brachiocephalic, brachiocephalic, a prominent aquiline nose with a depressed tip and large wings is very characteristic. Scattered in Anatolia, Armenia, the ancient Hittites were typical members of this race. So here's just one image that sort of highlights and explains this type. So here are ancient Hittites, and here right here is a Kurdish man, and here right here is an Armenian, and here is our Kurdish women, and here are Armenian and Kurdish women. This is an Armenian, this is a Kurdish woman. So, and these are the types that are said to be Armenoids. So both ancient and modern you seeing at the same time. And so now let's get into the Eurafrican. So this is from The Passing of the Great Race, and it reads, the Mediterranean race was first defined by Sergi, who also calls it Eurafrican. The Mediterranean race originated in Africa and is closely related to the Negro, both being long-skulled peoples descended from a common stock, the Euro-African. This is from General History of Africa, and it reads, particularly when we note once more that Mediterranean is not a synonym for white, Elliott Smith's brown or Mediterranean race being near the mark. Elliott Smith classes these Proto-Egyptians as a branch of what he calls the brown race, which is the same as Sergei's Mediterranean or Euro-African race. The term brown in this context refers to skin color and is simply a euphemism for Negro. This is from the contributions to the anthropology of Iran, and it reads, the Euro-African, this is by Hayden, and it reads, skin, dark complexion, florid, hair, dark, eyes dark, head very long, that's basically dolichocephalic, nose often broad, and prognathism often slight. And prognathism means protruding of the jaw. It extends outward slightly. So that's a Euro-African. So here is, just various images of Middle Eastern peoples, Bedouins and Arabians specifically. And here is, an ancient fresco or mural of a Akkadian uh, palace in Mari, Syria. And you can see that kind of matches no different with these peoples from Arabia, Bedouins, these what they tend to say more older Semitic types. So we looked at ancient artwork to tell what the phenotype was when it comes to both ancient and modern peoples, and we do see basically that there are two ethnic types in the Middle East. So here, let's look at a few. So here are your Akkadians of Mari at the top, and then you have your Sumerians at the bottom. Clearly, you can see a difference. Here's another image, closer image. These are from Mari, Syria, a known ancient Semitic city in Mesopotamia. And here are Sumerians. You can see there's a clear difference. See, clearly they depicted themselves differently. Here are Elamites, or some people might call Elamites, but here are Elamites, another ancient Semitic people according to the scriptures. Elam was actually the firstborn son of Shem, and this is how the Elamites depicted themselves. Now compare this to the way other groups in the Middle East depict themselves. These groups who came from either the north and spoke non-Semitic languages. And here's images of this right here. Actually, I've showed this before in the past. These are Bedouins from Syria, and these are Arameans, and they're being conquered. But also you can tell you can look at their conquerors and how they depicted themselves. But what I find interesting about this is that, for one, the skin color, as well as the hair color, and also the features of the face. Now, one thing I want to point out is these headbands, which is seen both in the Egyptian depiction of these Bedouin Syrians and in this depiction of the Arameans. So it's likely that I would say these two peoples are the same, because look at the headbands, look at the way they did their hair in braid-like or in locked-like fashion. But also, what you can see is the depiction of the same people by two different ethnic groups. This was found in Syria, or this was found in Assyria, and this is found in Egypt. So it's interesting how they sort of depicted these two people, this one people from two different regions. Anyways, and then here is an Armenoid, as they say at the bottom. Armenoid, and these are Sumerians. You can see the way that they are depicted as compared to the way these men are depicted in the Middle East. Again, just illustrating in ancient times, there are clearly two different types of people in the Middle East. So from the artwork, we can clearly see that there are two people that resided in the Middle East. Those who are the brown Eurafrican phenotype and those with the Armenoid phenotype. Also, to a certain extent, you can even extend this to modern populations. So I'm just put on the screen both the ancient and the modern Middle Eastern types. Here over here is right. These statues specifically are these are Southern Arabians, Sabaeans, and these are Ethiopians. You can see that there is a phenotypical similarity between them. And then these are just simply Arabians from the Red Sea region. And so basically, all these people will sort of be classified as the brown Eurafrican or the brown Mediterranean types. And then you have clearly a difference when it comes to the modern, but also ancient Middle Eastern types that are more Armenoid, like this Chechenian man and the Sumerian, or this Armenian woman and this Armenian men, and these Armenoid Sumerians, this Armenian man and this ancient Armenoid Middle Eastern. So that's also why I have a problem when it comes to the term Middle Eastern, because Middle Eastern, like when someone says you don't, like so and so doesn't look Middle Eastern, or this person looks Middle Eastern, or this is a Middle Eastern phenotype. My question is always, well, there's different Middle Eastern phenotypes, both anciently and modernly. Like, for instance, let's just use Jesus or Yeshua as an example when they say he looks Middle Eastern. Well, what Middle Eastern are we talking about? Are we talking about the more brown Eurafrican, brown Mediterranean, or are we talking about the more Armenoid? Because there's not one Middle Eastern phenotype. There are different Middle Eastern phenotypes. So what? Does so and so look like a Neelamite, or does so and so look like a Sumerian? So that's something to keep in mind when talking about the Middle Eastern phenotypes, both in ancient times and modern. It's not straightforward. There's definitely variety within this part of the world, any part of the world for that matter. I don't know why we seem to forget when it comes to the Middle East. But anyways, so the Armenoid type didn't just penetrate to Mesopotamia. I want to make that clear as well. It also went into Egypt and Arabia. So this is from the ancient Egyptians. This is from Elliot Smith, who we've mentioned quite a few times. And it reads, there is a considerable mass of evidence to show that there was a very close resemblance between the Proto-Egyptians and the Arabs. But here's the kicker. Before either became intermingled with the Armenoid racial elements. So again, we're seeing that there was a mixture with Armenoid type peoples. And we just read the Armenoid phenotype, what it is. So you kind of know who these people were that were mixing with Proto-Egyptians and mixing with Arabs. Because apparently, from what we see, Proto-Egyptians and Arabs sort of look the same, which makes sense from a biblical perspective. Check out my video on Eber and Azurad, dealing with the early descendants of Eber as well as Joktan. So, kind of makes sense when you think about it. Here is another book dealing with that, the Negro in the New World, and it reads, it is quite conceivable that the great peninsula of Arabia was once populated as far as its natural conditions allowed by a primitive Negro stock, which may have been later on partially exterminated by changing of by changing and unfavorable conditions of climate and by the aftercoming of the white man in his type. So basically we see that Arabia once had a quote unquote, primitive Negro, but let's just say Negro or dark skinned type of people, but it changed because of climate and quote unquote white men. And of course, that's likely referring to the Armenoids. The dark skinned South Arabian today is short and extremely round headed, brachiocephalic, but he was no doubt originally much taller and dolichocephalic, long headed, like the so called Hamites of East Africa. Early pre Christian skulls found at Hadronite were were marked were markedly dolichocephalic. It has been suggested that the definite change in the racial constitution of the people of the Hadronite resulted in the invasion and interbreeding of brachiocephalic whites such as Armenoids or Persians, who we read earlier, Persians are basically Armenoid as well. Henry Field suggests that Arabia's current ethnogeography is the result of the mixing of two distinct basal stocks, the dolichocephalic long-headed, dark-skinned Mediterranean/Euro-African and the brachiocephalic round-headed, fair-skinned Armenoid. So as it simply says, you basically had two different types of people, in the Middle East, and these types also mixed with one another. So here is from the book The Arabs by Bertram Thomas, and it reads: the original inhabitants of Arabia, then, according to Sir Arthur Keith, one of the world's greatest living anthropologists, who has made a study of Arab skeletal remains, ancient and modern, were not the familiar Arabs of our own time, but a very much darker people. A proto-Negroid belt of mankind stretched across the ancient world, from Africa to Malaysia, giving rise to the Hamitic peoples of Africa, to the Dravidian peoples of India, and to the intermediate dark people inhabiting the Arabian Peninsula. In the course of time, two big migrations of fair-skinned peoples came from the north, one of them, the Mongoloids, to break through and transform the dark belt of mankind beyond India, the other, the Caucasoids, to drive a wedge between India and Africa. So basically, you have two types of people, but the Middle East originally being more darker, but different waves of these people of these fair skinned people sort of came in and sort of divided and separated uh, the belt of dark skinned peoples. And continuing, it reads: the more vile invaders overcame the dark skinned peoples, absorbing most of them, driving others southwards where my own exploration is believed to have discovered vestiges of them in the natural sanctuary beyond the great sea, the great sandy ocean of Rub al Khali. So, just as I said earlier, these peoples of the north, these quote unquote invaders, as he even says, mixed with the dark skinned people and absorbed them. But some of these dark skinned Middle Easterners also managed to flee into the south, which is very interesting. So, Armenoid peoples didn't just stop in Mesopotamia, they also went from the north to Mesopotamia all the way into North Africa and Arabia. And, I think the Armenoids coming into the Middle East is very, very similar to what happened with the Aryan invasion of India. And I think that's what that author was referring to as well when he talks about that bridge being sort of broken. And that's something important that we should keep in mind because when the darker skinned Dravidian peoples inhabited and lived in India, but they were conquered and absorbed by this Aryan population. It kind of parallels the events of the Middle East. Interestingly enough, some anthropologists believe that the original Arabian population, just as an example, looked more like Dravidians, and some people even apply this to ancient, Mesopotamians as well. So this is from Henry Field in his Ancient and Modern Man in Southwestern Asia, and it reads, Dravidian and Arab have in them an inheritance from a common stock, an inheritance which has been retained more completely by the natives of India than by the people of Arabia. So he's saying that people in India, the Dravidians, look more like the ancient Arabians type, but even more so that Dravidians and Arabs sort of come from a similar racial type. And on the right hand side of the screen, at the top in black and white, are Dravidians, isolated Dravidian types that would have looked more, to a certain extent, even a bit more Australoid. But here's the second quote. This is from Marshall's and von Herrenfield's remarkable insight as a support of contemporary ethnology and modern genetic research. Sir Arthur Keith and Dr. Wilton Maron Croghan, in their discussion of the racial characteristic of the Southern Arabs. That's the name of the book. And here's a section of it, and it reads, the Arabian Peninsula was at one time occupied by a people intermediate to the Somalis on the one hand and to the Dravidian peoples of India on the other. So just to simply put it, they're saying that at one point there was a population that looked in between like a Somali and a Dravidian in Arabia. And on the bottom of your screen in color is a Somali. And so you kind of can see a resemblance between I guess you can say a pure Dravidian type and a Somali. And that racial type would have been in Arabia. So that's just another example. And here are old pictures, I believe from the 20s or from the 30s, 1920s, 1930s, of Arabians and of Bedouins. And you kind of can see that they sort of look Dravidian-esque, and they sort of, have that phenotype. So it's very interesting. So much like in India, when the Dravidians mixed with Aryans, it's believed that Armenoid people and the brown African people of Mesopotamia and the Middle East mixed. This mixture between the white and the black, so-called, created the intermediate modern Middle Easterners. Now, I'm not saying that I agree with this notion, but it is an interesting one. Basically, Semites are a mixture between lighter skinned and darker skinned populations. This is from Civilization or Barbarianism, and it reads, there is no better way to delimit the conditions of crossbreeding. In a defined paleo environment, a crossbreeding which ultimately may have led to the formation of the recent branches of humanity. Semites, Arabs, and Jews in a different geographical context. The formation of the Semitic branch occurred between the 5th and 4th millennia. This was genuine interbreeding between white, non-Mongoloid Cro-Magnon and black at the very beginning of the historical era. In the Riyadh Museum in Saudi Arabia, one can see the pre-production of cave paintings showing the Negroid type that inhabited the Arabian Peninsula in Neolithic times. This type, who progressively crossbred with white elements, came from the northeast to give rise finally to the Arabian type. Not until the Sabaean era, 1000 BC, was this crossbreeding completed in the south. So basically, you know, white and black types mixed, kind of creating that quote unquote, Semitic phenotype. But continuing, it says, all Semites, Arabs and Jews, as well as the quasi-totality of Latin Americans are mixed between of whites and blacks. So he's sort of comparing how the mixture between blacks and whites creating the Semite type is similar to the mixture between whites and blacks creating the Latin American type. Here's another book dealing with it, The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality, and it reads, anthropologically and culturally speaking, the Semitic world was born during proto-historic times from the mixture of white-skinned and black-skinned people in Western Asia. So, just that's plain and simple right there. These facts on which even Arab authors agree prove, as with shortly become evident, that the Arab race could not be conceived as anything but a mixture of blacks and whites, a process continuing even today. So, again, very simple. The Semitic type, including the Arab types, mixture of indigenous black and incoming whites. So, and just continuing, it reads, consequently, it is important to change our notion about the Semites, whether in Mesopotamia, Phoenicia, or Arabia. The Semites, insofar he is discernible objectively, appears as the product of a Negro-white mixture. It is possible that the whites who came to crossbreed with the Negroes in that area of Western Asia were distinguished by certain ethnic features such as the Hittite nose. Now that's very, very fascinating. Like I said, there is a notion that basically the modern Middle East was created by or from the mixing of white and black people. But what I find interesting is that specifically this white type was a Hittite type. They had a Hittite appearance. And basically, the Hittites were an Armenoid people. Remember, the so-called Armenoid type is defined by Hayden under the Eurasiatic brachycephals as Anatolian Armenian, dark hair, tawny white skin, medium stature, very brachycephalic, a prominent aquiline nose, a hook nose, with a depressed tip and large wings is very characteristic. Scattered in Anatolia, Armenia, the ancient Hittites were typical members of this race. And so what we read earlier, that this mixture of the Negro and white type creating the modern Semite, and even adding the fact that this white type has the Hittite nose and Hittite features, they're basically saying that it was the mixture of a Negro and a Armenoid type that created the modern Semitic type, which is kind of interesting. Remember, here are the features of the Hittites, and there's an Armenian whom the word Armenoid even comes from. So I find that to be very interesting. But the real question is this: is there any scientific data that can back up the diluting or interbreeding of these peoples? So this is from the questionable contribution of the Neolithic and the Bronze Age to European craniofacial form, and it reads, it is a further surprise that the Epio-Paleolithic Natufian of Israel, from whom the Neolithic realm was assumed to arise, has a clear link to sub-Saharan Africa. If the late Pleistocene Natufian sample from Israel is the source from which that Neolithic spread was derived, then there was clearly a sub-Saharan African element present of almost equal importance as the late prehistoric Eurasian element. Now here's the kicker. The interbreeding of the incoming Neolithic people with the in situ foragers diluted the sub-Saharan African traces that may have come in with the Neolithic spread, so that no discoverable element of that remained. So apparently there is scientific papers talking about a diluting of certain uh, certain peoples and features and things. This picture of a mixture between the incoming farmers and the in situ foragers had originally been supported by the archaeological record alone. So that's very interesting. So we do even have modern scientific papers that speak about diluting and interbreeding of populations in the Middle East. But now let's ask a biblical question really quick. Who would have these dark-skinned peoples have been in the ancient Middle East, and who would the lighter-skinned peoples have been? Let's just go a bit biblical for a second here. So this is from Perky de Eleazar, Rabbi Eleazar, and it reads, "He especially blessed Shem and his sons black, but calmly, and gave them the inhabitable earth. He blessed Shem and his sons, they are entirely white, and gave them for an inheritance the deserts and its fields. These are the inheritance with which he endowed them." Excuse me. And this is from the history of the messengers and the kings, and reads, "The children of Sam, Shem, settled in the center of the earth, which is between Sat Durma and the sea, and between Yemen and Syria. Allah made the prophets from them, revealed the books to them, made them beautiful, gave them a black complexion, luminous and free of blemish. The children of Japheth settled in Safwan toward the north. They are light-skinned and very fair-skinned." This is from Persian historian Tabari, and it reads, "Born to Noah were Shem, whose descendants' colors are a black complexion with a light brownish undertone and a dark blackish brown. Japheth, whose descendants are very fair-skinned and olive-skinned." This is from Ibn Abbas, and it reads, "Allah made the descendants of Sam, Shem, and the descendants of Ham black-skinned, and he made the descendants of Japheth white-skinned." This is from the 13th century Bar Habricus, and it reads, "Shem, the land of the browns, and Japheth, the land of the reds." So, very simple. Shem's descendants are basically described as being brown, dark brown and black. Japheth descendants are basically described as being white, olive, olive, white, and tawny. So Shem's descendants would have been darker, and Japheth's descendants would have been lighter. So this is kind of what I think of when it comes to Shem's descendants in ancient times, and even today. And then this is what Japheth's descendants would be, both in ancient times and today. So it would seem that Japheth could have been those northern invaders that came into the Middle East. This would make sense because the Book of Jubilees even records that Japheth settled the cold north, and Shem was in the warmer middle. This is from Book of Jubilees, chapter 8. "This is the land which came forth for Japheth, a great land in the north, but it is cold." As you can see, most of the northern part of the Middle East, which Anatolia, south of the Caucasus, northern parts of Iran. It's all very mountainous. This is the Zagros. This is the Tartarus mountain ranges, and it's all very, very uh, snowy. It's all very cold. So that kind of does fit with what Jubilee says. A great land to the north, and it is cold. Fits perfectly. Shem's land is all this right here. So the Armenoid phenotype is generally in that area as well, where the descendants of Japheth settled. So here is the territory of Japheth, as we can see from various Bible maps. If you were to just type in the territory of Japheth, Anatolia, southern Caucasus, and northern parts of Iran. And then, when it comes to the Armenoid phenotype, where is it? Common in mountain regions of Asia Minor, which is Anatolia, especially Armenia and Anatolia. Well, there you go. And it's seen in what? People like the Hittites, who are Indo-Europeans. And what is the Armenoid phenotype? Just quickly going over it. Hook nose, often black-haired with light brown skin. Simple enough. You can see right here in the map where the Armenoid type is Anatolia, South Caucasus, northern parts of Iran. So, and just dealing with Japheth and his territory. Japheth, may God enlargeth, was one of the sons of Noah. Apparently, Japheth was fruitful, for he had at least 7 children who became the ancestors of the people who lived to the north and west of Palestine in the modern territory of the Anatolia and the Aegean. Skipping down to yellow, it reads, thus Japheth primarily became the ancestor of the modern-day Indo-European family of nations. So also, the territory of Japheth fits the origins of light skin, as well as the ethnic group, which would have become Proto-Indo-Europeans, which was a mixture of Caucasus hunter-gatherers and the Yamnaya to create, the Proto-Indo-Europeans, or should I say Caucasus hunter-gatherers with Eastern European hunter-gatherers to create the Yamnaya, who are Proto-Indo-Europeans. So this is from Upper Paleolithic genomes reveal deep roots of modern Eurasians, and it reads, to explore further, we looked at genotypes in 2 pigmentation genes proposed to have been strongly selected in the ancestors of modern Europeans, namely SLC45A2 and SLC24A5. Select SNPs in the SLC45A2 and SLC24A5 genes contributed to lightening of skin and are almost fixed in modern Europeans. We found that Katos and Saserbia have the ancestral version of the SLC45A2 variant, but both Caucasus hunter-gatherers have the select version of the SLC24A5 gene, encompassed by the most commonly associated haplotype C11, found in modern populations. So there you go. This is the Caucasus hunter-gatherers, light/intermediate skin. This is the SLC24A5 gene, and then it passes over here. Then you have the Eastern hunter-gatherers. This mixture creates the Yamnaya people. The Yamnaya are Proto-Indo-Europeans, and then they will spread it out across all of Eurasia. So here it is showing you genetically. Genetically, Proto-Indo-Europeans are half Caucasus hunter-gatherer, and they're half Eastern hunter-gatherer. That created Proto-Indo-Europeans. And then they will go into Europe and mix with populations there as well. And here are the features of the Kurgan caves. Kurgans would be Proto-Indo-Europeans, Yamnaya people, so that's what they looked like. Good depiction of early Japhetic people, actually. So, also the territory of Shem fits the populations of darker skinned peoples, depending on the way you view the age of the earth. Natufians are the best fit for the ancestors of Semites for both a young earth and even an old earth perspective. This is from In the Hot Pursuit of Language and Pure History, and it reads, this paper makes an additional inference, since there is archaeological and physical anthropological reason to believe that the Natufians were related to modern Semitic-speaking peoples of the Levant. This is from the questionable contribution of the Neolithic and the Bronze Age to European craniofacial form, and it reads, it is a further surprise that the Epipaleolithic Natufian of Israel, from whom the Neolithic realm was assumed to arise, has a clear link to sub-Saharan Africa. Interestingly enough, however, the small Natufian sample falls between the Niger-Congo group and the other samples used. This placement suggests that there may have been a sub-Saharan African element in the makeup of the Natufians, as shown in Figure 1. The Somalis and the Egyptian Bronze Age sample from Naquata may have given a hint of a sub-Saharan African component. So here Natufian falls sort of in between Niger-Congo and prehistoric / recent Northeast Africa phenotypically. That's what they kind of fall in between. So here is a reconstruction of a Natufian, and this is sort of how he could look in the flesh. But personally, I would say the hair would be a bit more curly. Most ancient human populations in the Neolithic likely had curly hair, but I would say that the rest of the features is pretty on par. So genetically, we're able to show and prove that it is highly likely that dark-skinned peoples of the Middle East come from Shem, and that light-skinned populations come from Japheth. But some may say, why is Japheth in the Middle East in the first place? Where in Scripture does it say that Japheth would even be in the Middle East? Well, actually, we see it right here in Genesis. It says in Genesis chapter 9, verse 27, and depending on which Bible version you read, it all pretty much says the same thing. May God extend Japheth's territory. I feel like, let me just read actually all of them. May God extend Japheth's territory. May God expand the territory of Japheth. May God enlarge Japheth. And you get the point. I feel like this could be referring to migration, the extension, the expansion of Japheth, of his people, of his descendants. Now, what's the next part? May Japheth live in the tents of Shem. May Japheth share the prosperity of Shem, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem. May he dwell in the tents of Shem. And you get the point. This could refer to Japheth being in the tents of Shem. A tent in ancient times, or even in modern times, it's a home, it's a place you live. This could refer to land. May Japheth dwell in the land of Shem. So let's put this together. May God extend Japheth's territory. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem. So this could be referring to Japheth expanding, migrating into the land, into the tents of Shem. And we'll touch more on this deeper at a later time, but I feel like this is what this verse, Genesis chapter 9, verse 27, could be referring to. An expansion, a migration of Japheth, of Japhites, of Proto-Indo-Europeans, into the territory, the land of Shem, of Semites. But to simply put it, basically, I see evidence of Japheth being in the land of Shem. But let's put everything together that we learned so far. One, we're able to see through legend and tradition that there was warfare between people north of the Middle East and south of the Middle East, specifically Caucasian Armenians versus Mesopotamian Semites. And two, looking at skulls, we're able to see that there was indeed an influx of Armenoid peoples that over time eventually overtook and intermixed with more of the brown, your African peoples, and some of these peoples also fled south. So, and also when it comes to all this, there's a third important fact. We also see that there was interbreeding and mixture of two different types of people in the Middle East, one being darker, the other lighter. We see this in old and modern sources. So, this makes sense on a larger scale when it comes to the mixing thing because we actually do find light skinned people with haplogroup E in the Middle East. Not everybody with haplogroup E is dark skinned in the Middle East. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are dark skinned Middle Easterners with E, but not all of them are. And we can find dark skinned people with haplogroup J in the Middle East. And the reason why finding people with haplogroup J in the Middle East that are dark skinned is because this is evidence of mixing, since haplogroup E people in origin would have been darker compared to the lighter skinned people with J way back in ancient times. So now that we see variation of both types, a person with E that's light and a person with J that's dark, that kind of right there shows that there was definitely mixing between the two. So, and one thing that I should note as well is that lighter skin is associated with Japheth, and light skin originated in the north of the Middle East, in the Caucasus, which is the territory of Japheth. That's interesting. And when it comes to Shem, he's typically in the warmer parts of the Middle East, which is south of the north, in places like Mesopotamia and Arabia. And when these Armenoids came into the Middle East, they came, likely as being the descendants of Japheth, especially since this phenotype is associated with people who claim descent from Japheth, like the Armenians. Another Togarma, this one being the son of both Tyrus and Gomer, is mentioned by Armenian Moses of Caron and Georgian Litoni Mevroni, who regarded Togarma as the founder of their nation along with other Caucasian peoples. According to Moses of Caron's History of Armenia and to Letoni Mevroni's medieval Georgian chronicles, Torgomos was thought to have lived in Babylon before he received the land between the two seas and two mountains, i.e., the Caucasus, in his possession. He then settled near Mount Ararat and divided his land among his sons. Hayek, first son of Torgomos, inherited Mount Ararat and founded the Armenian nation. Kartelos settled in northeast from Ararat, founder of Kartil, who united other brothers and founded the Georgian nation. Herlos settled in the eastern parts of Ararat, and Caucasus, or Koloskus, settled beyond the Caucasus range. And this is only dealing with the sons of Togarma, and most of his descendants are said to have settled in the Caucasus Mountains. So, and we know this is the typical area of the Armenoid type, common in the mountain ranges of Asia Minor, especially Armenia and Anatolia. And we have Kavaskus as the supposed ancestor of Chechens and Ingish, according to Georgian chronicles. And when it comes to their type, range typical of the Caucasus Mountains, they're called Mitibids, excuse me for my mispronunciation, are typical of the Georgian population and common among Chechens and Ingish. And they're also brachycephalic as well. And when it comes to Togarma, many commentators connect Togarma with the Armenians. The Armenians themselves traditionally claim to be descendant from Hayek, son of Togarm, and ancient Greek writers speak of the Armenians as famed for their horses and mules. But when it comes to the Armenid type, it's widespread, found in the most specialized form in mountains of Asia Minor. So, and they're also hyperbrachycephalic. So I would say that the more white or light-skinned, dark-haired, dark-eyed, hook-nosed people types would belong to the descendants of Japheth, specifically his son Togarm, and possibly other descendants of Japheth that were in the Middle East, such as Medai. But it's ironic because this phenotype is often associated with the so-called, Semitic type, but it's not really Semitic in origin. And I I wouldn't disagree. I want to make this known. I wouldn't disagree that it's Middle Eastern, but I wouldn't say that it's Semitic in origin. This is more so a non-Semitic Middle Eastern phenotype, typical of peoples like Hittites and Sumerians, who are both non-Semitic speakers. Again, the so-called Armenoid type is defined by Hayden under the Eurasiatic brachiocephals as Anatolian, Armenian, dark-haired, tawny white-skinned, medium stature, very brachiocephalic, a prominent aquiline, hooked nose with a depressed tip and large wings is very characteristic. Scattered in Anatolia, Armenia, lands of Japheth, the ancient Hittites were typical members of this race. Hittites or Indo-Europeans. Here's the Hittite phenotype. Here's an Indo-European Armenian. This phenotype, again, I would not really associate with Semitic in origin. It is more so an Indo-European phenotype. Biblically, is possibly more so a Japhetic phenotype. Remember, the Hittite people, member of an ancient Indo-European people who'd appeared in Anatolia at the beginning of the second millennium BCE. By 1340 BCE, they had become one of the dominant powers of the Middle East, and that's possibly why it's such a widespread phenotype. And here's a Sumerian with this phenotype as well. Another non-Semitic people who I read earlier. Sumerians were speakers of a Caucasian language, likely a Japhetic language. Most historians have suggested that Sumerian was first permanently settled between circa 5500 and 4000 BC by a West Asian people who spoke the Sumerian language, a non-Semitic and non-Indo-European alloglutive language isolate, in contrast to its Semitic neighbors. So it's not a Semitic language. One thing is for certain is that there was an invasion of Armenoid peoples from the north of the Near East into the south of the Middle East. The Armenoids were lighter skinned, descending from Japheth, and the brown ear Africans were darker skinned, likely descendants from Shem. And here's how I would envision things back then. The Mesopotamian Afrosan Semites looking like this with curlier hair, and the Japhetic northern Armenoid peoples looking like this. Sort of how I would see things. But this is where we end the invasion of the Armenoids, the brown Eurafricans versus the Armenoid peoples.
The War of the Armenoids, the Akkadians versus the Gutians. Just like from our previous video, the invasion of the Armenoids, the brown Eurafrican versus the Armenoid, we were trying to discover if there was an Armenoid invasion of the Middle East. We could tell by using skulls that there was indeed a shift in the population, and there is a legend like Hayek that also tells us of warfare between northern Caucasian peoples and southern Semitic peoples. This time, we're going to look and see if historical records and even DNA could back up this similar fact. So, the Akkadian Empire was a Semitic civilization in Mesopotamia. Their empire ruled for centuries in the Fertile Crescent, but everything changed when the Armenoids attacked. The Akkadian Empire was attacked by the people from the Zagros Mountains, and they didn't just fight the Akkadians, they actually won. They defeated the Akkadian Empire and ruled it for a time, and these were a non-Semitic people known as the Gutians. The Akkadian Empire flourished in the 24th and 22nd centuries BCE, ruled by Sargon and Namnir-Sin. It eventually collapsed in 2154 BCE due to the invasion of barbarian peoples and large-scale climatic changes. The Akkadian Empire was an ancient Semitic empire centered in the city of Akkad, which united all the indigenous Akkadian-speaking Semites and Sumerian speakers under one rule. Around 4,300 years BP, Sargon of Akkad united city-states of Mesopotamia, present-day Syria, and Iraq into the world's first empire. The Empire of Akkad collapsed in 2154 BC, within 180 years of its founding. The collapse ushered in a Dark Age period. Guti people. This is from Britannia. Guti mountain people of ancient Mesopotamia who lived primarily around Hamded in the central Zagros range. The Guti were a strong political force throughout the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC, especially about 2230, when they swept down into Babylonia, southern Mesopotamia, overthrowing the Akkadian Empire. So here are the Zagros Mountains. It's in Iran, and it even goes a little bit into Iraq, but here's just one map showing the Zagros Mountains where these Gutians came from. So the Gutian dynasty was a dynasty that came to power in Mesopotamia, 2199 through 2119 BC, or possibly 2135 through 2055 BC, after displacing the Akkadian Empire. The Gutians were described as part of the horde that toppled the kingdom of Akkad, or Agad. It was a conglomeration of tribes that descended from the Zagros Mountains, possibly drawn to the plains for its prosperity. The Gutians practiced hit-and-run tactics and would be long gone by the time regular troops could arrive to deal with the situation. Their raids crippled the economy of Sumer. The Sumerian king's list indicates that the king Ur-Ut of Uruk was defeated by the barbarian Guti, perhaps around 2150 BC. The Guti swept down, defeated, and demoralized Akkadian army, took Akkad, and destroyed it around 2115 BC. Ultimately, Akkad was so thoroughly destroyed that its site is still not known. Thus, a short dark age swept over Mesopotamia. So the Gutian peoples coming from the Zagros Mountains managed to defeat the powerful Akkadian Semitic empire. And they destroyed it so well, a lot of its sites are still unknown to us today. And it was a dark age to the people that got defeated, of course. But for the Gutians, it was quite a great time. Conflict between people from Gutium and the Akkadian Empire has been linked to the collapse of the empire towards the end of the 3rd millennium BC. The Guti subsequently overran southern Mesopotamia and formed the Gutian dynasty of Sumer. The Sumerian king list suggests that the Guti ruled over Sumer for several generations, following the fall of the Akkadian Empire. So for several generations, these Gutian, these Zagros peoples, ruled Sumer. Akkad bore the brunt of this as the center of the empire, so that it was in Akkad that the Guti established their own center in place of the destroyed Akkad. This is from Ancient Egypt and the Near East. This is a book dealing with Near Eastern history. And it reads, during the last years of the Akkadian Empire, there were many incursions by fierce tribesmen from the southeast carrying out hit-and-run raids. These intruders were the Gutians, one of many peoples living in the Zagros Mountains. These raiders plundered the rich cities of Mesopotamian plain and were always long gone before the army could arrive to confront them. The Gutians pillaged all over the Akkadian Empire. Although they occupied only a few remote regions, finally they destroyed Akkad itself.
So again, here's just a map of the Zagros Mountains. It is a very cold place, northern part of the Middle East, where it's typically very snowy, typically very cold. So that kind of gives you an idea. Makes sense why these people were leaving back then and even today. Mesopotamia, especially towards the south, was a more fertile area, good for farming, good for raising animals. And so these mountainous peoples in this cold mountainous range came down and just took it by force. No different than the Vikings, no different than the sea peoples, raiding, pillaging, and taking over land. That's human history for you. So, according to the historian Henry Holy Howarth, a Syrianologist, Theophilus Pinches, renowned archaeologist Leonard Woolley, and a Syrianologist Ignorus Gleb, or Ignorus Gleb, the Gutians were pale in complexion and blonde. This identification of the Gutians as fair-headed first came to light when Julius Opet published a set of tablets he had discovered, which described Gutian and Serbian slaves as Nemrum or Nemrutum, one of its many meanings being light-colored. So, in a sense, you sort of could consider the Gutians as Vikings, being light-haired people, but it can also refer to light or pale complexion, meaning white skin. So it's another way of looking at it. So we don't know much about the Gutians. I want to make that clear, but some actually do believe that the Kurdish people of today may partly be descendants of the Gutians, and I think that's very important to note. This is from the Middle East Reader, and it reads, "Yet another group of Kurds whose existence can be traced to the 3rd millennium BC were the Guti, whose kingdom corresponds with the part of Kurdistan currently held by Iraq, and who were one of the oldest independent kingdoms of the ancient civilized East." And so here's a map of Kurdistan. Let me make it bigger. So Kurdistan is in that part of the world where the Gutians would have came from, because it kind of stretches all the way from Anatolia, but also into Iran, overlapping with the Zagros Mountains where the Gutians came from. And here's the Iraq, Kurdistan, Zagros Mountains. And as I showed earlier, it is a very cold place. I can see why the Gutians wanted to leave, especially being all the way back in the 3rd millennium BC. It would have been extremely hard living in these conditions. So it makes a lot of sense they would have left. Very similar to the Vikings when they left Scandinavia, those cold parts of the world, for warmer places like Britain and France and such. So this is from Encyclopedia of the Peoples of Africa and the Middle East, and it reads, "The region known as Kurdistan comprises a territory about the same size as Texas, spread across 3 modern-day Middle Eastern countries: Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. The region includes mountains such as Mount Ararat and the Zagros Mountains, with pasture lands and valleys covered by forest. Lakes also mark the territory, including Lake Umara in Iran and Lake Van in Turkey. The Halaf period was followed by the Hurrian period from 2600 to 6300 years ago, which was based in Mesopotamia and the Zagros-Tartars mountain area of Iran. The Hurrian peoples spoke a language related to modern Chechnya. The Hurrians, in fact, comprised a number of clans and sub-clans, probably not Indo-European in origin. They dominated the area now known as Kurdistan, as well as Anatolia, modern-day Turkey.
Sumerian writing dating to around 3000 BCE referred to the land of the Kurda or Korda and the people living there as the Korduchi and the Guti and other variants. These are thought to be the earliest written references to the peoples who would become known as Kurds. Assyrian records from this period describes these people as the Gurdu or Kurdu around 1000 BCE. The term Kurd first appears in Assyrian records with reference to those people, also called Kurti or Kurhi or Kurti, living south of Lake Van in present-day Turkey. So here's a map of the Kurdish region in the Middle East. Let me make it bigger. So like I said, Kurdistan, it's in all these Middle Eastern countries from Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Armenia. And here's where the ancient Gutians would have been. And it overlaps with the same territory of modern-day Kurdistan. And here is a map showing the Hurrians and other Hurrian-related peoples and territory. You can see right here you have the Kurda that we mentioned earlier, and you have the Kurti as well, or Kurdaka. So kind of gives you a nice visual understanding of what we're dealing with. A lot of various Hurrian tribes and peoples. So this is from the Chechenians. We're going to come down here to the relevant part of the section. Well, actually, I'll read all of it because it kind of does deal with the Guti as a whole. By understanding the Hurrians, we kind of get a good understanding of the Gutians because Gutians may be a branch of Hurrian tribes people. So despite the obscurity of their origins, the Hurrians became one of the great and influential peoples in the Near East, from the 3rd millennium BC to the 14th century BC. Their original home was possibly the South Caucasus down to the Armenian Plateau and the Zagros-Tartars Mountains. Later, they extended to Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and northern Syria. The Hurrian language was neither Indo-European nor Semitic, but was akin to Northeast Caucasian languages, or Alduin languages, descendants of Urartuan, including Chechenian and Lezgian. Hurrian civilization reached its akin in the period of the 16th to 14th century BC. The general accepted date for the downfall of the Hurrian civilization is 1365 BC. The numerous clans of the Hurrians, such as the Gutis, which we named earlier, Gutis or Gutians, the Hattians, Kassites established the Kassite kingdom of Babylon in the 15th century, and the Kurti or Proto-Kurds. And so we'll stop right there. Main thing I want to get from this section is the fact that the Hurrians were in the same general area of the South Caucasus, Armenian Plateau, and the Zagros-Tartars Mountains, just like the Gutians. And also, it's believed that Gutians and Proto-Kurds descend from Hurrians, or they're a branch of various tribes of the Hurrians. And it reads, the Hurrians were so ubiquitous that many Indo-Iranian and Indo-European peoples are believed to have substantive Hurrian contributions in their ethnogenesis. For example, the Kurds consider themselves and their culture as descendants of the Hurrians and their civilization despite linguistic unification. So Kurds sort of are descendants of Hurrians, sort of like a mix of Indo-Iranian and Hurrian peoples. So the Kurds still live in the Zagros mountain range, which both the ancient Gutians, Hurrians, and Iranians lived. Some believe the Gutians may be a branch of Hurrians, but the Kurds are a mixture of both the Hurrians and the Iranians. And genetically speaking, Kurds are basically a split between Caucasian and Iranians. So perhaps this, makes sense after all. This is a paper, HLA alleles and haplotypes in the Turkish population relatedness to Kurds, Armenians, and other Mediterraneans, and reads, Turkish and Kurdish HLA profiles are studied for the first time. The comparative study of their allele frequencies, characteristic haplotypes, genetic differences with other Mediterraneans is complemented by neighbor joining dendrograms and correspondence analysis. Turks, Kurds, Armenians, Iranians, Jews, Lebanese, and other Eastern and Western Mediterranean groups seem to share a common ancestor, the older Mediterranean substream or substratum. Anatolian Hittite and Hurrian groups older than 2000 BC may have given rise to present-day Kurdish, Armenian, and Turkish populations. Turks cluster within the Eastern Mediterraneans, including Kurds and Armenians. Taking all our different types of data analysis together, Turks, other Anatolians like Kurds and Armenians, and Iranians appear as belonging to the older Mediterranean substratum included within the Eastern Mediterranean group. In summary, it seems then Turks, Kurds, and Armenians are very close genetically, and all of them seem to have been living in the area for many millennia. So here is Kurdish inhabited area. And so from the genetics paper we just read, they are from this part of the world from, thousands of years ago. And so they're also believed to be connected to the Hurrians. And if the Gutians are a branch of Hurrians, then perhaps there is truth to the Kurdish people descending or being related to the Gutians. Here is the map showing Hurrians. It's in the same area of Kurdistan. This is what you see in brown. So this genetic paper is called Genetic HLA Study of Kurds in Iraq, Iran, and Tbilisi, Caucasus, Georgia, relatedness and medical implications. Kurds from Iraq, Dohuk, and Erbil area, North Iraq, have been analyzed for HLA genes. Their HLA genetic profile has been compared with that of other Kurd groups from Iran and Tbilisi, Georgia, Caucasus, and also worldwide populations. Our HLA study conclusions are that Kurds most probably belong to an ancient Mediterranean / Middle East / Caucasian genetic substratum, and that present results in those previously obtained by us and Kurds may be useful for medical or for medicine in future Kurd transplantation programs. It is discussed that one of the most ancient Kurd ancestor groups is in Hurrians 2,000 years ago. On the other hand, Kurd people live in different countries in the Near East, such as Syria, Armenia, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. The so-called Kurdistan, land of the Kurds, Kurdistan is a region placed South Caucasus and north of ancient Mesopotamia, according to genetic studies like HLA in Turkish and Kurdish populations. An Anatolian Mediterranean source for both populations was put forwards. It may be possible that Kurds are initially coming from ancient Hurrians reviewed in, and then it gives the two sources. So here's a map of Kurdistan, as we've seen many times, and matches perfectly with Hurrian territory. So continuing with the study, it says, the second cluster comprises Europeans, Mediterraneans, Caucasus, and Iranian populations. Iraq Kurds, Iran Kurds, and Georgia Kurds are located relatively close together. And here is a pie chart just showing it, and they are very close, all linked together. Plain genetic distance DA show that Iraq Kurds closest genetic distance are the following: Near East populations, Iran Kurds, Palestinians, Far Parsi, Georgia Kurds, and Ashkenazi Jews, Eastern Mediterranean populations, Armenians, Cretans, and Macedonians, and Mediterranean populations, Sardinians, Spaniards, Algerians, and Italians. So here's a chart just showing it, all these groups that the Kurdish people in Iraq, Georgia, and Iran are related to. Our conclusions were that their HLA profile showed that Kurds form part of Mediterranean stock of people and also had Caucasus genetic traits, Slavic Georgians. Also, it is worth mentioning that Lak population, East Caucasus area, may be close to both Lar and Kurd populations, and Lak name could be considered composed of Lur and Kurd words. In the present paper, we have analyzed HLA genes in Kurds living in North Iraq, Erbil, and Dohuk areas. Comparison with other populations place them as a Middle Eastern population close to Kurds from Tbilisi, Georgia, Palestinians, Armenians, and Kurds from Iran. In both analysis, figure 2 and 3, Kurds are also close to Caucasian, Slavic Georgian populations. Conclusion is that Kurds are genetically close to surrounding Caucasian and Mediterranean populations and that have remained settled down in Kurdistan since ancient times. Supporting historical events is reviewed in our previous work. HLA genetic similarity have been reported between Turks, whose genes belong to Old Anatolian stock, and Kurds. Turks and Kurds speak languages that are included in different families. However, Kurd HLA genetic studies include them into Mediterranean stock together with Turks. Other genetic studies based on Y chromosome in Kurds from Turkey, Georgia, and Iran identify the dominant presence of haplogroups originated in Middle East, Anatolia, or Mesopotamia that show a close association with Jews, Lebanese, and Turkish genes. Also, Iranian populations are close to Kurds. Thus, Middle East peoples from Mediterranean border and Kurds seem originally to belong to a similar ethnic group according to HLA autosomic and Y chromosomes genes results. Kurds have always lived in the mountains, being autochthonous or indigenous for 6000 BC. Hurrians, whose language was Caucasian and not Indo-European, may be Kurds' ancient genetic background, reviewed in reference, and it gives a reference. By 1200 BC, Medes and others invaded Hurrian area. In summary, all three Kurd populations studied in the present paper are genetically close together and to other Mediterranean and Caucasian populations according to HLA genes. And so here again, it's just a map of Kurdistan in that territory of the Hurrians. And here is the ancient map of the Hurrians. Here is Kurda and Kurti and Kurdaka, where the Kurds would have, well, the ancestors of the Kurds would have been, and the Guti, or the Gutians, the Zagros mountain range. Here's the final paper, population genetic relationships between Mediterranean populations determined by HLA genes distribution and a historic perspective, and it reads, Kurds and Armenians are genetically very close to Turks and other Middle Eastern populations. Here is Kurdistan. So, the Kurds genetically linked to ancient Hurrians, and Kurds genetically linked to Caucasian and Iranian populations. This is very important because if Kurds are descendants of Gutians, then this shows us the likely genetic makeup of the invaders and destroyers of Akkad. But are there any genetic papers that can actually back this up? Are there papers that can back up the fact that ancient people with Caucasian/Iranian DNA swept through Akkad and destroyed it? This paper is called Continuity and Admixture in the Last 5 Millennia of Levantine History from Ancient Canaanite and Present-day Lebanese Genome Sequences. And it reads, the admixture time also overlaps with the rise and fall of the Akkadian Empire, which controlled the region from Iran to the Levant between 4.4 and 4.2 KYA. The Akkadian collapse is argued to have been the result of a widespread aerification event around 4,200 years ago, probably caused by a volcanic eruption. Archaeological evidence in this period documents large-scale influxes of refugees from northern Mesopotamia towards the south, where cities and villages became overpopulated. Future sampling of ancient DNA from northern Syria and Iraq may reveal if these migrants carried the Iran Chalcolithic related ancestry we observe in Bronze Age Sidon and Jordan. So this is from the Genomic History of the Middle East, and it reads, present-day Levantines are drawn toward Bronze Age Europeans, Iraqi Arabs, Iraqi Kurds, and Assyrians appear relatively closer to ancient Iranians. This is powerful information for several reasons. 1. Non-Semitic speakers carried Iranian DNA, conquered and destroyed the Semitic empire of Akkad. This shows that Iranian/Caucasian DNA cannot be Semitic in origin. After all, if the Gutians were a tribe of Hurrians, then they would not have been Semitic speakers. The Akkadians did not view the Gutians as their people. Furthermore, if Gutians are Hurrians, then it's likely that they would have carried haplogroup J. This is from How Eurasia Was Born. I'm just reading what's in yellow. And it reads, the Northeast Caucasian language family seems to show clear links to ancient Eastern Anatolia, as most subclades of J1-Z1842 can be linked to the Armenian highlands in present-day Azerbaijan, precisely fitting the exact location of the core Araxes culture. 3 subclades of it, J1-ZS3042, J1-ZS5658, J1-ZS2872, and J1-Y5353 are widespread among Northeast Caucasian groups, suggest Northeast Caucasian languages to have originated from the core Araxes culture, as ancient J1 subclades also seem to have been present in the ancient Levant as well. This supports the existence of the Alduin language family, linking Hurrian to Northeast Caucasian. And this is from Origin and Diffusion of Human Y Chromosome Haplogroup J1-M267, and it reads, around the time of the Neolithic demographic transition, the genome-wide ancestry of West Asian populations was geographically structured into 3 groups. Among them, haplogroup J-M304 is found in the Caucasus/Iranian and Anatolian hunter-gatherers and farmers, but not in the Levantine ones. Unfortunately, so far, DNA means ancient DNA, studies are missing from the Arabian Peninsula and Mesopotamia, where haplogroup J-M304 is frequent nowadays. So it's likely that the Akkadians carried haplogroup E and autosomally more similar to other Afro-Asiatic populations, since Afro-Asiatic is Semitic and Semites are Afro-Asiatic people. So this is from the Bayesian phylogenetic analysis of Semitic languages identifies an early Bronze Age origin of Semitic in the Middle East, reading only what's in yellow, we estimate that Semitic had an early Bronze Age origin in the Levant, followed by an expansion of Akkadian into Mesopotamia. The most plausible candidates for Semitic remigration to the Fertile Crescent, with TMRCAs fitting the arrival of Akkadians and other Semitic peoples, are certain subclades of both E-V22 and E-V12, with relatively early TMRCAs present in the Middle East, could be candidates for such a remigration as E-F GC14382 and E-V3262. And that was from How Eurasia Was Born. And this is from J1. It's definitely not Semitic in origin, and it reads, according to the theory, Afro-Asiatic languages spread to Asia via E1b haplogroup, not J1 haplogroup. It is historically known that a ruling elite class of Afro-Asiatic people, Akkadians, Assyrians, etc., also invaded the north of Mesopotamia and brought their Afro-Asiatic languages to the central and northern parts of Mesopotamia during the period of Akkadians and Babylonians. Elite dominance model of E1b1 might be supposed for Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians. In this sense, it might be theorized that Sumerian was the main language of ancient Mesopotamians before Afro-Asiatic E1b overwhelmed Mesopotamia, elite dominance model. So these non-Semitic migrants from the north that conquered and destroyed Akkad would have carried haplogroup J, and the Akkadians, on the other hand, would have been haplogroup E. Certain distribution patterns suggest that this eastward expansion of the Indo-European family occurred through northern Mesopotamia south of the Armenian highlands for long populated by speakers of Aldoian languages, and ancient Indo-European lineages presumably populating northern Mesopotamia before the Akkadian conquest. Lineages suggesting migrations to have occurred from Anatolia to northern Mesopotamia include subclades of J2A-M47, J2B-Y22075, J2B-Z43946, and J1-FGC6064, suggesting an Indo-European population in eastern Syria and northern Mesopotamia before the Semitic expansions. So again, this paper is actually differentiating between J not really being Semitic, because all of this J markers they're talking about how this J was moving around before Semites were even expanding at the time. So it's very interesting. With all that being said, this is very telling because it fits what we learned about when it comes to the invasion of the Armenoids into the lands of brown African Semites in Mesopotamia. This is from reports on the human remains found at Kish, and it reads, it is possible that even in this period, the Armenoids of the north were already beginning to infiltrate into northern Sumer. It must be remembered that soon after the fall of the Semitic Empire of Akkad, the entire land of Sumer and Akkad was ruled for over a century by the Gutians from the north, between the upper and lower Zeb rivers. The valuable results obtained by the authors of this paper confirm what the historians had assumed in regard to the early mixture of Sumerians and Semites at Kish, the oldest capital of Sumer and the greatest metropolis of the north, later known as Akkad. Dr. Bringston finds an interesting admixture of the round-headed Armenoid type. This must be explained as an infiltration from Syria and the Hittite region if there are not normal variants. So basically, we're seeing this Armenoid type of people come into Akkad, and they even ruled Akkad for a time, but the main point is to see this rising force of Armenoid round-headed people. from a biological standpoint, and it matches with the DNA. The population of both Upper and Lower Mesopotamia in prehistoric times belonged to the brown or Mediterranean race. While this basic stock persisted in historical times, especially in the south, it became increasingly mixed, especially with the round-headed Armenoid peoples from the northeast mountains owing to the recurrent incursions of mountain tribes into the plains. Kind of reminds you of the Gutians coming into Akkad. So this fits perfect with the DNA study about migrants from the north overpopulating the south, which, is Mesopotamia. I'm just going to read this again. The admixture time also overlaps with the rise and fall of the Akkadian Empire, which controlled the region from Iran to the Levant between 4.4 and 4.2 KYA. The Akkadian collapse is argued to have been the result of a widespread edification event around 4,200 years ago, possibly caused by a volcanic eruption. Archaeological evidence in this period documents large-scale influxes of refugees from northern Mesopotamia towards the south, where cities and villages became overpopulated. So furthermore, the description of the Gutians being light-skinned that we read from earlier fits with what anthropologists said about Armenoids, who are light-skinned themselves, coming from the north and conquering the darker-skinned Eurasian or the Eurafrican peoples. The so-called Armenoid type is defined by Hayden under the Eurasiatic brachycephals as Anatolian Armenian, dark-haired, tawny white skin, medium stature, very brachycephalic, a prominent aquiline nose, hook nose, with a depressed tip and large wings is very characteristic. Scattered in Anatolia, Armenia, and ancient Hittites were typical members of this race. So just think of Hittites, like I always say, just think of Hittites and Armenians when it comes to the Armenoid phenotype. And as you can see on the screen, Hittites, Armenian, and these are Kurds. So that kind of gives you an idea of the Gutians, and this kind of gives you also an idea of the Hurrians. The Hurrians likely would have had a similar phenotype like this, since, Hurrians were heavily admixed with the Hittites. It's believed that Kurds descend from Hurrians and Armenians descend from Hurrians, so this is also a good way to think of Hurrians as well. So this dealing with the brown Eurafrican, particularly when we note once more that Mediterranean is not a synonym for white. Elliott Smith's brown or Mediterranean race being nearer the mark, Elliott Smith classes these Proto-Egyptians as a branch of what he calls the brown race, which is the same as Sergei's Mediterranean or Eurafrican race. The term brown in this context refers to skin color and is simply a euphemism for Negro. So again, here are frescoes or murals of Akkadians, and as you can see, they're clearly a brown people, dark-skinned brown people with black hair, dark eyes, and to the far left is, just people with a very similar brown tint of skin and dark hair and dark eyes. Kind of a good example of Akkadians, perhaps, in the flesh. So, also, what's interesting about the Gutian invasion of Akkad is that some people actually connect this with the story of Hayek, the Armenian. According to the accounts of Moses of Caron and Sextus Julius Africanus, the battle occurred between the dynasty of Hayek and a Chaldean dynasty in its third generation that had control of Babylon and the remaining territory of Akkadia under King Bulus, a symbolic Babylonian/Akkadian god of war or founder of Babylon, depending on mythological tradition. The conflict is said to have happened in 2492 BCE or 2107 BCE. Bel may symbolize the Gutian dynasty of Sumer, which ruled remnants of Akkadia as a tyrannical power during a Mesopotamian Dark Age after the Akkadian Empire broke up in 2154 BC. Gutian is also overlapping overlapping with Chaldea's territory. So it's kind of interesting how the story of Hayek may actually sort of be historically true in the sense of if it's taking place in the same time with the same people as the Gutians. And this is from the Heritage of Armenian Literature, and it reads, Hayek, the legendary archer, has been part of Armenian culture and history since time immemorial. Hayek is considered the patriarch of the Armenians, and it is indeed for this reason that Armenians call themselves Hay. The well-known epic of Hayek's fight against Bel provided substantial proof that Hayek and his people stood up against Bel and halted the unrestrained influx of Semitic peoples from the south. So, if this is the case, then these are the descendants of Japheth invading into the lands of Shem. Hayek is a descendant of Japheth. Perhaps this makes sense because Japheth would enlarge and dwell in the tents of Shem, according to Scripture. This is from Ancient History Encyclopedia, Armenian Mythology. This is the story of Hayek and Bel, and places the origins of the Armenian people as the descendants of the biblical Noah via his son Japheth. Hayek, a descendant of Japheth, a noted archer, hence his later association with Orion, rebelled one day against Bel, the evil and repressive Babylonian tyrant, and returned back to his homeland around Mount Ararat and in ancient Armenia. Bel followed Hayek and his relations, so that a mighty battle followed in which Bel was killed. Hayek then gave his name to his descendants, the Hay people, and the name of the region of Armenia, in the Armenian language, Hayeste. Togarma. Many commentators connect Togarma with the Armenians. The Armenians themselves traditionally claim to be the descendants, or to be descendant from Hayek, son of Torgon. And so here's a map just showing Japheth's territory, and as we can see, Togarma, and this is the territory where, the Gutians and Hurrians would have been. And here's, typical phenotype as well of the people of that region. And Genesis chapter 9, verse 27 does read that, may God extend Japheth's territory, and may Japheth dwell in the tents of Shem. Again, this could be referring to migration of Japheth's, first expansion, then migration of Japheth's people into the land of Shem. And we'll touch deeper on that at a later time. So, interestingly enough, when we put everything together and line it up from what we've just covered from previous videos and this one, 1. Legend. The story of Hayek, the Armenian, versus Bel of Akkad. 2. Chronology. Armenoids versus brown Eurafricans. 3. History. Gutians versus Akkadians. 4. Genotype. Ancient Iranian DNA overpopulated Mesopotamia. And 5. Y chromosomes. Haplogroup J penetrated Mesopotamia. We're starting to get a good picture of what was going on in the ancient Near East, which might explain why it looks the way it looks today. But are there more methods we can use? Yes. But this is where we end the War of the Armenoids, the Akkadians versus the Gutians.
And this is where we end the video with the Armenoid Invasion. And again, it's very similar, no different than the Aryan invasion of India. But in this case, it's the Armenoid invasion of the Middle East. And if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. Don't forget to subscribe and share the video. Click the bell. Leave a comment for any questions you might have. And follow my social media platforms that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. And with all of that out of the way, have a great day and shalom.